Welcome tonight. My name is Nienke de Haan. I work for Studium Generale, with a platform for knowledge and reflection of Utrecht University. And tonight is the first lecture in a series of 4 on optimism and pessimism. And I'm curious first to hear from all of you, who of you is optimistic about his or his own future? So raise your hand if you're sort of quite optimistic about your own future. Well, for the people at home, I think that's nearly everybody. So that's good news. Maybe we have some optimists here. Another question, who of you is optimistic about the future of the world, the state of the world in this time? 1, 2, 3, 3.5. Oh, 4, 5. That's a lot less. This is a typical phenomenon, and we'll get to this later on as well. Our guest tonight will also explain how this comes. How come we're all sort of optimistic about our own future, but we think society as a whole is going down. And I came across the idea of this series the past half year when reading the news. I think 2020 started off quite terrible. It seems the worst year ever. We had bushfires in Australia, in Siberia. You almost forget it because it's Corona now, but there were many terrible things going on. Then Corona came. Then at the moment there's the prospect of a new economic crisis because of the virus. Then Corona reached recently Camp Moria as well. And then if that wasn't bad enough, there was fire there as well. And at the moment there are many people in need of a new place. And I think if you watch the news at the moment, it's hard not to get depressed. So today, so that was all the news that came. And then I read something of a philosopher called Popper. And he said people have a moral duty to be optimistic. And I thought, really, is that true? So then I was very glad I got in touch with Dr. Hanno Sauer. We emailed, and I'm very glad he's here today, all the way from Düsseldorf, to speak with us about optimism and whether there's a need to be optimistic. He's optimistic himself. According to him, there is moral progress in the world. We're actually getting better and better, and we're likely to see more moral progress in the future. Hanno Sauer is assistant professor in philosophy at Utrecht University, and since 2019, so last year, he leads the research project Process, in which he studies moral progress. And what that is exactly, you're here tonight. He will share some of his first thoughts on this with us. So what is moral progress exactly? Which signs of it can we see today? And what can we expect in the future? We'll get to you as well in the discussion. I have a very long microphone, so if you have any questions, think of them already. We'll get to them. For now, please give a warm applause to Dr. Hanno Sauer. Is your thing switched on? Yeah.
Yeah, thanks a lot for the nice introduction. Thank you all for coming. Welcome to all of you. My name is Hanno. I teach ethics and political philosophy here at Utrecht University. I'm interested in how the mind works, how human nature functions, and whether that tells us anything about ethics, about right and wrong, good and bad, virtuous and vicious. And these days I'm thinking a lot about moral progress, which is the topic that I'll address today. I'll in particular address the issue of whether we have reasons to be optimistic about the future, and in particular whether we have reasons to be optimistic about the moral quality, so to speak, of our future. I'll try to articulate what I think a good understanding of moral progress is, and I'll try to furnish some sort of explanation of why we are, I believe, excessively pessimistic, why pessimism is overrated when it comes to evaluating the prospects of the future and the future of social change more generally. And I'll start with a couple of examples of moral progress. The first one is one that I'd like to use. It was made famous by Michel Foucault in a book called Discipline and Punish, and this is a picture showing a famous execution that happened on what was then called the Place de Grève in the center of Paris. The unfortunate person that was executed that day was a man named Damien, and he was executed for attempted regicide. So he wasn't even successful at killing the king. And at the time, people were quite inventive when it came to the death penalty. So what they did was, the eventual plan was to have him drawn and quartered. But what they did first, they would take red-hot pincers and tear off pieces of his flesh from the upper body. And then they would pour molten lead into the lesions and the lacerations that they created. And once they had tormented him enough, they thought, they brought in 4 horses and they tried to tear him apart. But the 4 horses, for some reason, they were maybe a bit starved, so they couldn't get the job done. So they brought in 2 extra horses. And the 6 horses couldn't get the job done either. And so while he was still alive, they had to basically hack off his arms and legs so the horses could finish the execution. And this is a gruesome tale, of course. I think it was one of the last executions by drawing and quartering that were done this way. And I'm just inviting you to imagine how how inconceivable it would be, how ridiculous even, how unthinkable it would be to imagine something like that happening, for instance, on the Dam Square in Amsterdam today. It just couldn't possibly happen, and it's even laughable to entertain a thought like that. This is a picture of a Chinese woman with bound feet. Foot binding was around for pretty much exactly a millennium in China. And what people used to do is, this was mainly reserved for higher status girls and women. At a young age, people would very, very tightly bind the feet of these poor girls, so that when they grew up, their feet would be permanently deformed, in many cases making it close to impossible to walk, and making it impossible to walk meaningful distances. And this was considered a sign of high status. But then this practice, after having been around for 1,000 years, it quickly vanished. It almost evaporated within a couple of years in the beginning of the 20th century, and it hasn't been heard since. And I think there may be a very small number of very old Chinese women around that still have bound feet, but it has been completely gone ever since the beginning of the 20th century. This is another practice that's gone, that's been abolished, and that just faded away. This is perhaps the most famous duel that ever happened. This one is between Bill Burr and Alexander Hamilton. They met an early morning in 1804 in Weehawken, New Jersey. And this is another practice that is entirely gone now. It was already illegal at the time, and we just don't feel the need to prove our honor in this silly and harmful way anymore. And indeed, in this case, Hamilton was challenged by Burr over some minor remark he had made over dinner. Like Hamilton said he was a dangerous and incompetent man, or something like that. Something, very, very slight and minor. And still, they felt compelled to risk their lives in this obsolete ritual. And Hamilton died the next day from the injuries that he had sustained during the duel. This is my final example for the introduction. This is a picture of a slave ship. So this is basically the layout that people designed for the transatlantic slave trade from mostly West Africa to Northern and Southern America. And you just see the desperate and dire and horrendous conditions that these poor people were put into when they made the Middle Passage to the New World. And of course, many of them died during the voyage, and many they were just suffering enormously. And there are lots and lots of pictures that you can look at that give you more detail on how these slave ships were organized. And slavery was abolished in the US in 1865, close to that. It's now illegal everywhere in the world. There are still some practices in some places that are akin to or comparable to slavery and to bondage and forced servitude, but slavery is illegal at the very least in all places. Now, when it used to be pretty much the thing that built the economy in almost all places for much of human history. And I want to suggest that these are just 4 examples. I could go on and on and on, but these are 4 examples that probably most of us, I hope all of us in this room, would find it very, very difficult not to classify these examples as examples of moral progress, as instances or cases where a morally bad thing was around that was replaced with something that is in some way an improvement, and in many ways a very large improvement on the previous situation. And I'll spell this out a bit more, what I mean by moral progress, and there are 5 parts that I want to go into today. One is, very briefly, I'm just going to give you an idea of what I mean by moral progress, basically just how I use the word. In the second part, I will address 2 recent challenges that are based on the fact that we are evolved creatures, challenges to the very feasibility of moral progress. And here the idea would be that we've evolved in some way, and that makes certain desired moral gains unlikely or improbable or unstable. In the third part, I want to develop something like a map or a typology of different forms of moral progress. I'll just give you a couple of examples and try to distinguish various general types of social improvements, of social changes for the better that have occurred and that are still ongoing in many cases right now. Now, if there is so much progress, as I will claim, why do people tend to be at least comparatively pessimistic? And we've already seen, and I'll say a bit more about that, people tend to be quite optimistic about themselves, but they're a bit more gloomy, at least, about the fate of society in general. So why is that? Why is it possible for us to identify pretty clear instances of improvements and yet find it psychologically hard to tolerate that there should have been much improvement in the past, or that kind of improvement will continue in the future? And then I'll conclude with some words about optimism and utopianism. So just very briefly, here's how I use the term moral progress. And this is going to sound trivial, and it's supposed to be trivial, because I'm just explaining to you what I mean by that. So when I speak of moral progress, I just mean things get better, morally speaking. In almost all cases, these will be social states of affairs, social practices, and the way that people live together. And these ways of people living together, people's lifestyles and practices and so on, they get better, but not just in any sense, in a moral sense. And there are 2 further distinctions that you can introduce. One is moral progress in the sense of morality being the thing that undergoes the improvement. So it's our moral norms and values and attitudes and dispositions and virtues, and they are the thing that gets better. And the second sense of moral progress that I want to include in this definition is it's not our morality and our moral code and values undergoing the improvement, but it's other things in society that improves. Social progress, maybe health goes up, longevity goes up, child mortality goes down, literacy goes up, democracy becomes more widespread. And these are social improvements, but they are welcome from a moral point of view, even though it's not the morality itself that undergoes the improvement. And I like to use this wider notion of moral progress, where things get better, morally speaking, and in these two senses of our values become better and social conditions improve in ways that are pleasing or desirable from a moral point of view. Now, is progress possible? So before I say more about what I think progress really consists in, let me address two challenges on the basis of evolution. And I'm just sketching these, because they get complicated fairly quickly. The first one comes from biological evolution, and the second one comes from cultural evolution. Biological evolution first. And here the idea is that we've evolved under certain circumstances. The critical period of human evolution happened, very roughly speaking, give or take, 2 million years ago up to, say, 12,000 years ago in the Pleistocene. And here the idea is that the conditions under which we evolved our psychology were such that we became intensely tribal. We started seeing the world in terms of us and them, in-group and out-group. So we used to live in very, very small groups, and these groups, they were in intense competition amongst each other. So in order to thrive for these groups, you had to be very cooperative within the group and very, very hostile and competitive and aggressive towards whatever you construed as an outgroup. And now the idea is that if we are so tribal and if we are hardwired to see the world in terms of us and them, then there are certain forms of moral progress. For instance, cosmopolitan peace and international cooperation and caring for the global poor and stuff like that are simply not psychologically feasible for us, right? So these kinds of suggestions to reform society aren't going to be stable because our psychology just doesn't support them. And the main reason I think that this is false is that moral progress primarily happens not in individual minds and psychologies, but in institutions. We just don't need to extend our empathy towards millions and billions of people in order to get certain forms of international cooperation going. We can rely on externalized social structures and institutions to make that happen. So you can think of international trade and peaceful commerce. You can think of democratic voting. You can think of large-scale insurance policies. And all of these institutional structures, they allow us to cooperate, even if the psychology that we inherited isn't really made for that. We're kind of bypassing and tricking ourselves into behaving nicely without actually changing the psychology that we inherited from our ancestors. So I think this challenge doesn't really go through in the end. Now, a second challenge is based not on biological evolution, but on cultural evolution. And here the idea is that human life, look around you, depends very, very deeply on cumulative culture, on accumulated cultural capital, knowledge, skills, institutions, rituals, practices, and so on, that were built by previous generation and that kind of form a reservoir of cultural heritage for us. And the thing about that is that this reservoir is often intransparent to us. We don't really know how things work and why things work the way they do. Sometimes you can go to small-scale societies, and these people have elaborate cooking rituals, for instance, right? They prepare manioc with 14 precise steps, or they detoxify nardoo with 15, very, very intricate steps. And if you miss one of these, you'll get poisoned from the toxins in these plants. But the people who prepare the food, they don't know why they do that, right? They've just inherited that from cultural evolution. And if that's true about how society works as well, then progress becomes difficult to achieve because we don't really know how to design society, right? We don't understand how it works, and we see that we find it difficult to export certain institutions to other places where they, for some reason, don't work. And so this is another possible ground for skepticism about the possibility of moral progress. But I think this challenge also doesn't go through because cultural evolution is all about piecemeal improvements. It may be that progress is slow, but there is progress ongoing, and certainly cultural evolution has nothing to do with stagnation. And in fact, political conservatives who try to harness the force of these types of arguments in favor of conservative political positions, the kind of scenario that they want to return to, like, a 50s lifestyle or something, to get to that from today would be precisely the kind of radical social engineering that by their own lights, cultural evolution forbids. So I think this challenge also doesn't go through because cultural evolution should make us, in fact, quite optimistic about the possibility of moral progress. So I think there are, just to get these two challenges out of the way in the beginning. Now I'll have to rush through this a bit because I don't have unlimited time. Let me check. We can bring that up in the Q&A if you have questions about the distinctions that I'm about to make. And I'll just start with this typology that I have in mind. So the first thing I'd like to note is that I don't think that moral progress is this one thing. Moral progress, there are different types of moral progress, and together these types or dimensions of social improvements in a moral direction, together they shape the moral development of a society. And I'm going to start with the first example. In the literature, this is known as demoralization, and the slogan is that moral progress occurs when we demoralize things, that when we come to recognize that some things that we thought were morally important are actually morally neutral, and we just don't assign any moral relevance to these things anymore. So a slogan would be, we get rid of bad norms that we don't need by demoralizing them. Perhaps my favorite example comes from the history of film. That's the toilet on the left. This is the toilet where Janet Leigh flushes down the money in Psycho. And actually what scandalized people at the time when Psycho came out is not the shower scene. It's not Norman Bates's transgressive behavior. It's actually the fact that this was the first mainstream film that would show a toilet on screen. Because at the time there was something called the Motion Picture Production Code, or informally known as the Hays Code, after William Hays, who oversaw this code. And it just forbid the depiction of these kinds of things on screen in a mainstream Hollywood production. And look it up, Hays Code, Motion Picture Production Code. It's just a stone pit of great examples for demoralization and moral progress. Because there's all sorts of stuff like kisses may not last longer than 2 or 3 seconds, and white slavery, for some reason, we're not supposed to show that. Scenes of childbirth, of course, any kind of suggestive dancing, silhouettes. So it's a lot of it is about sexual mores and sensitivity towards religion. But now we have to read about this stuff, right? No one, when you watch the movie, you don't recognize that this is something that people used to worry about, right? It's become thoroughly demoralized, and you need to read a book to find out that this was actually a thing that people thought had moral import. Adam Smith, in The Wealth of Nations, founder of economics, he claimed that singing for money is a kind of public prostitution, and that you're only supposed to do that for free. When people developed life insurance, people were outraged. They said, well, you're putting a price tag on money, it's going to make wives desire the deaths of their husbands, and so on and so on. And now, with these examples, we just don't even recognize the moral flavor of these things anymore. And as we shouldn't, because singing for money is just fine, and showing toilets on screen is just fine, and taking out life insurance is just fine. So these things have become properly demoralized and morally neutralized. The converse thing is moralization, which happens when there is a practice that we used to think of as morally neutral, but have since then come to recognize as something that actually is morally salient. An often used example is sexual harassment. Even the term is new, right? And it used to be just people used to just be indifferent about it, and it's just a fact of life that bosses would make, lewd and suggestive comments to their co-workers or their secretaries. And these types of behaviors, they had to become moralized first, and we had to develop a kind of vocabulary to articulate the moral odiousness of these practices, to really put our finger on it and make them criticizable in a moral light. And these developments are still ongoing. Right now, people are trying to moralize new things, like cultural appropriation, perhaps, or flight shame, right? So it used to be that people just thought, well, it's just a means of transportation, right? I need to get a place, and so I'm going to, use whatever's best, and in many cases that's going to be a plane. But now we've recognized that there are various, problematic side effects that come from air travel, and people are there are attempts ongoing to moralize these issues and to again coin a term that makes it possible for people to see these things as something that may have a morally problematic status, like flight shame. So this was demoralization and moralization. A third example or third type of moral progress is when we try to redraw the boundaries of the moral community, when we try to redraw the boundaries of who deserves moral recognition and who should be given and attributed moral status. And basically the history of the world is one long history where people try to dehumanize and abuse and discriminate against and murder and exterminate people that they considered members of an outgroup and not properly fully human and not deserving of the same kind of recognition. And again, there are current developments underway to try to include non-human animals in the circle of moral consideration, and to recognize that pigs and cows and chickens, that they are beings that are capable of suffering, capable of forming family bonds, and people try to include these beings in the circle of moral concern, to expand the circle of moral concern in a way that tracks what really matters for someone to belong to the moral community, which is capability to suffer, maybe intelligence, maybe autonomous thinking, whatever your favorite criterion is. And again, we have the converse development, because sometimes what's called for is not to expand the moral circle, but to contract the moral circle, because we used to include entities in the circle of moral concern that don't really belong there, right? Sometimes we pay excessive reverence maybe to certain sites. Famous example comes from animal trials, which are not just an urban legend. They used to happen more or less regularly, and people would put pigs and donkeys, usually domestic animals, on trial, and then there would be, a court and people speaking on behalf of the animal that maybe harmed the owner or destroyed the property of the owner. And we now recognize that, animals may be moral patients, right? They deserve our protection, and we shouldn't subject them to cruelty and gratuitous pain, but they're not moral agents in this sense, like they could, understand what they're supposed to do and then adjust their behavior in light of that. And there are controversial cases undergoing, happening right now. So recently, I think in 2017, a river in New Zealand, the Wanganui River, was granted legal personhood because people thought, it's a coherent living whole that kind of bears these features of being a fully developed person. And some people think that maybe there could have been a less animistic a solution. I mean, surely this river deserves all the environmental stewardship and responsible protection in the world, but maybe not consider it a person the way that we consider people and some animals persons. So there are expansions of the moral circle and contractions of the moral circle. This is an important one, and this has been always a very hot and important topic, is not just material, but also social equality. More progress occurs when we remove arbitrary privileges from society. Maybe not all privileges, but the arbitrary, the morally irrelevant privileges that are based on which family you're born in, what the color of your skin is, what your gender is, and so on, and so on, and so on. And you see that, currently the Black Lives Matter movement is fighting for the completion of this process where minorities, black people in the US especially, are granted full equality before the law and are given the same kinds of opportunities that for instance, white people, just take for granted and enjoy as a normal thing. And of course, we've seen that with the abolition of legal privileges, such as the distinction between an aristocracy and a class of peasants, or caste systems in various places in the world that people keep fighting for, or keep fighting against being put into social categories that don't allow any mobility and that are just seen as natural and immovable, and that inflict conditions of disadvantage and a hardship on one group and privilege another. Another important dimension of moral progress happens when people's liberties and freedoms are increased, when people start to enjoy more and more autonomy, when people are granted the opportunity to pursue their life plans as they see fit. And for the vast majority of human history, that was not something that that the vast majority of people was able to do, who were peasants, slaves, had to live in bondage, had to kick up to some feudal warlord, and many social movements have fought for the removal of these barriers to their freedoms, so that individual people can make the best of their lives. Now, of course, this process, like all of the processes that I've been talking about, is very much imperfect and not fully realized, but you see that there is a dynamic in many societies where once you start removing the worst types of economic insecurity, people start demanding freedoms. And they start to demand that they can maybe choose their occupation, that they can choose the place where they live, that they can open a business, that they can participate in their national politics, and so on, and so on. And this is the final dimension of moral progress. We don't just want to make all these noble-sounding improvements, but in the end, it often comes down to just making people better off. Just reshifting the balance of pleasant over unpleasant events and experiences in people's lives. And you see that, again, this is another very much imperfect development, but you see that there are various trends in society that have just improved people's well-being by improving their health, by improving their security, and so on and so on. For the longest time, people thought there were kind of certain limits to how much happiness you can achieve. I mean, and there are limits. But what we see is, and this is the graph on the right, that overall social development and indeed economic development tends to be a thing that that makes people happier and that increases their life satisfaction. So these were just examples, right? There were no real arguments so far. I'm just giving you a sense of, or to try to call to your attention, various types of moral progress that I think we recognize and that we intuitively understand that there may be something interesting going on, and there may be actual improvements to our moral values, norms, and our moral code. And if these examples mean anything, the question remains, why do we see this effect that we saw in the beginning, that we still, and myself included, we still tend to be kind of on a gut level, tend to be quite pessimistic about the prospects of social development and improvement of our lives and the moral quality of society. And I'll try to. This is not an exhaustive list, but I think these are some important aspects that explain why we are more pessimistic than I think is warranted by the actual evidence and data. So the first concept that I'd like to mention is, it's an ugly term, but it's simple enough to understand. It's prevalence-induced concept change. What this means is that the fewer blue things are around, the more likely you are to classify things as blue, right? So when the prevalence of something goes down, you are more prepared to classify something or to put something into a certain category. And that can happen with moral concepts as well, right? So the better society becomes, the keener and the more merciless and the stricter our moral standards become, such that society may improve quite meaningfully, but our moral standards accelerate even more, such that from the perspective of our moral standards, it looks like society is actually getting worse. But that's just a perspectival phenomenon that has to do with the increased fine-grainedness of our moral concepts and our moral sensibility. And very much a related concept is concept creep. There's a vertical type of concept creep and a horizontal type of concept creep, which is just that you expand the meaning of a concept vertically to include less severe instances of something, racism or sexism, for instance, and horizontally you classify some things that you used to not see as racist and sexist as you start including that in this category. And I don't want to say that this is a bad thing, right? I'm not jumping on this, we are hypersensitive snowflakes kind of a point. We want our moral standards to become stricter, right? We want our moral values to become less lenient. We don't want to become more tolerant of suffering and abuse, right? We want to become less tolerant of it, and we adjust our concepts in this direction. The problem just occurs that because our concepts improve in this desirable direction, when we start thinking that society, falsely, that society is objectively getting worse, right? That's just the thing that I'm trying to caution you against. It's a good thing when we become less tolerant of morally objectionable behavior, but we shouldn't conclude from that society is actually getting worse when you look at it, objectively. Another thing that can happen is that we observe a trend and we think it's going to go on like that, right? Perhaps the most famous example is the Malthusian trap. At the time, so this was in the late 1700s, Thomas Malthus wrote his essay on population, and he thought, well, it's just a no-brainer, right? The economy grows in a linear fashion, but the population grows exponentially. So there's going to come a point where these two lines intersect, and people are going to starve, right? Because we are overburdening the economic carrying capacity of the nation, for instance. And it just turned out that he was completely wrong, right? Under the right conditions, this can happen, right? But still, it's unwarranted to project this trend naively into the future, because we've seen that in developed countries, it's the opposite. Economic growth starts to become exponential, and population growth starts to become linear and level off and even drop down at a certain point, so that this kind of catastrophe that's been repeatedly announced, even in the second half of the 20th century by Paul Ehrlich and other people, this catastrophe doesn't have to happen, at least. Another phenomenon that boosts our nostalgia and biases our assessment of the past and thereby our assessment of the prospects of the future is a thing called reminiscence bump. This is basically a kind of memory bug, which means that we don't remember everything in our lives equally, right? Some phases we remember more vividly, and we have more memories of that phase. And for psychological reasons, for the vast majority of people, that phase that we remember best happens to be the phase that we think is best, right? So it's basically this phase between 15 and 30 where people, maybe find a partner, have the first successes, find a job, start to really have great and exhilarating experiences. And we draw most of our memories from that pool. So naturally, when we look back, the past is going to seem more appealing to us than the future, because we think that, I'm 70 now, and for the past 40 years, stuff has just gone downhill, and I don't know why, and it's going to continue like that. This is a graph illustrating the phenomenon that we saw in the beginning, which is the divergence between individual optimism and social optimism. If you want to see any, of these graphs in more detail, if you want, to know where these arguments or data come from, just write me an email and I'll give you the source. And you see that on the left. So basically, the red line is how likely people think that it is that society is going to get worse, and on the right, the red line is how likely people think that their own situation is going to get worse. And you see that almost no one believes that their own situation is going to get worse, but very many people believe that the social prospects are bleak. But this is, of course, just as impossible as everyone thinking that there are above-average drivers. It just, doesn't work this way. And this is another interesting phenomenon that explains this divergence between individual optimism and social pessimism. Or it doesn't explain it; it just diagnoses it and quantifies it. And here are two final examples that I want to give for why we tend to be overly pessimistic about the prospects of the future sometimes, which is when you have certain progressive gains. In many cases, and there's no reason to deny that, in many cases there may be a net benefit for most people, there may be a net benefit for society, but there are still going to be some people who stand to lose from a certain type of development. And I say winners and losers here, I don't mean in a derogatory sense. I just mean people who benefit from something and people who are harmed by a certain development. So it may be that I think it may be that globalization is basically a great thing for a lot of people, and that this is a trend that we have good reason to continue. But of course, it may be that domestic workers in the Rust Belt, for instance, that they don't benefit from this when their jobs are being outsourced, right? I mean, some people benefit, but there are still identifiable groups that stand to lose from certain progressive gains. And in general, the gains and the benefits, they tend to be more widely spread out across society in general, and the losses, they tend to apply to an identifiable group, for instance, Dutch farmers or something like that, that can form a coalition and make their voice heard, which creates the impression that there are all these people who lose from something just because the people who gain from it aren't like a cohesive, identifiable group that would participate in political campaigning as a group like that. And finally, of course, there are not just some groups that benefit and some groups that don't benefit from various social developments. There are also trade-offs between different values that we realize in when social change for the better happens. So sometimes society improves along one dimension and declines and deteriorates along a different dimension, right? So you can think of community relations, for instance. When people have more freedom of choice, when they can choose their partner, when they can choose their occupation, when they can choose their identity, when they can choose where to live, when they can choose which gender to identify with. That's all great. But again, there's no need to deny that there may be costs to that. For instance, you lose a source of values, you lose certain social bonds, you may find that there is a decrease in social trust and social capital that is supplied by these community relations that you have eroded by giving people more freedom of choice. I tend to think that these arguments are exaggerated and that people kind of just forget the oppressive and suffocating aspects of these communities that they used to be in. So I tend to think that in general, there's more. Well, the cost-benefit calculation works out, so there's a larger benefit than the cost. But again, there's no need to deny for people who think that there has been progress that some developments have a cost to some groups of people and to some values that we also think are worth cherishing. So. What I think moral progress comes down to, just to summarize, is we replace bad norms with good norms. That's the distinction between demoralization and moralization. We attempt to properly draw the boundaries of the moral community, sometimes expanding the circle of moral concern, sometimes contracting the circle of moral concern. We want to promote equality, increase material, economic, socioeconomic equality, but also remove arbitrary differences in social status and social position and prestige. We want to increase and promote people's liberty, their freedoms, their opportunities, their autonomy, their independence, and remove oppressive regimes that constrict people, that prevent people from acting the way that they want to act. And we want to just make people better off, meaning that we want to create conditions under which people are more satisfied with their lives, where they are healthier, where they are happier, where they have more just even fun stuff to do. And we tend to be overly pessimistic because we think that the feasibility of certain forms of moral progress is threatened by the fact that we are certain biological creatures that may not be able to care for everyone equally, and I've tried to explain why I don't think that this follows. It may also be that progress is limited because we are bad at designing it, because we don't really know what makes our society work. And then there is a mix of stricter and more, stricter moral criteria and biases of our memory and biases of predictions of the future, and then this distinction between people who stand to gain and stand to lose from various progressive developments, and actual trade-offs between different values, such as freedom of choice and being really at home, say, in a community that you unconditionally belong to. And now, just very briefly, I'm not entirely sure whether there is a moral duty to be optimistic. I think that optimism is, when we look at the facts and the data, we see that optimism is the attitude that is supported by a rational and as impartial and as objective as we can look at the world. So it's not really about what kind of person you are. Are you an optimist or are you a pessimist? What's your temperament and what's your outlook on the world? Optimism, it seems to me, is supported by the facts, and pessimistic attitudes can, in many cases, be explained away as something that is misleading us and biasing our assessments in all sorts of unsavory ways. And of course, we start to acquire a duty to be optimistic about the world once our pessimism makes us endorse foolish policies. And I think it's fair to say that we are basically living in that time right now, where a pessimistic attitude towards the future, towards immigration, towards various kinds of social changes makes people support harmful and regressive policies. They think that they are improving the world and that they are preventing various doomsday scenarios from materializing. But in almost no case, when we look at these predictions, these doomsday scenarios actually happen. Just think about what people announced would happen once gay marriage, for instance, becomes legal. The fabric of society would be torn apart. It would be chaos on the streets. And of course, none of that happened, not even close. And now people just, forget about that, as if they didn't have these, terrible pessimistic predictions about the future. So I think we have reasons for being optimistic about moral progress, as long as we don't needlessly sabotage it. And I don't think that we need to have an idea of what a morally perfect society at the end of history would look like in order to make that judgment. We can compare states of affairs in terms of better and worse, in terms of improvements and deterioration, without being able to anticipate some sort of, or to flesh out some sort of utopia in light of which this comparison can be made. I can say that this one painting is better than this other child's painting without having an idea of what the perfect painting looks like. So I like to say that morality it works a bit like the headlights of a car. When you use them, you can only see so far, but when you rely on them, you can make the whole trip. Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much. I'm at least a little bit more optimistic after all these examples, so thanks a lot. I have this big microphone, so I'll come to you in a bit, so think of your questions. I have one question already. You say we need optimism in order to make good decisions. At the same time, I'm wondering, don't we need maybe pessimism or realism, like the people who are going on the streets, for example, this week of Extinction Rebellion, maybe the people who are in the Black Lives Matter protest. I think if we ask them, they're not the optimists.
Yeah. Well, they must be optimists to some extent, right? Otherwise, they wouldn't be marching on the streets. So they must believe in the possibility of promoting change to some extent. There's no resignation in these people, right? People who demonstrate, they are at least optimists in that sense. But already when you asked that question, you said, well, should we be optimists or should we be pessimists or realists, right? And partly, I think one way of rephrasing the point that I was trying to make is that optimism is the realistic option, right? It's not that we tend to identify, being realistic with having this bleak outlook, but I don't think that the pessimistic outlook is the realistic outlook. I think the optimistic outlook overall tends to be the realistic outlook. But of course, you're right. If we want to promote further social change, we must also be able to identify what goes wrong, right?
Yeah, I thought maybe optimism makes us lazy as well, because we think, well, there are many things that are going bad, but if you look in the long term, 200 years ago, but then still things are really going bad sometimes.
Yeah, and I think that's a good point, but I think ultimately that's an empirical question. It's an empirical question whether an optimistic attitude makes this or that person lazy or proactive, or whether a pessimistic attitude is what does that to this one person, right? It may also be that pessimism leads to desperation and fatigue and resignation, and you just think, well, what are you going to do? Things always get worse. So I think this is just an empirical question. What kind of psychological disposition gets different people to do different things? And I wouldn't want to generalize for everyone from that. I'd still like to maintain that the evidence and the data suggest that things are going surprisingly well, and often people are surprised by various numbers if you show them about the development of health or democracy or these types of moral progress that I've mentioned.
All right, thank you. Is there anyone in the audience with a question? Yeah, I'll come to you.
Yes, I have a question concerning the Black Lives Matter movement where we were discussing. Don't you think that maybe now, regarding the Black Lives Matter movement, these protests are kind of uncovering these patterns of underlying racism in...
Sorry, can you repeat that? Uncovering what?
Uncovering some underlying patterns of racism in the system, mostly in the USA, but also in other countries. So don't you think that sets us back in what we think was improvement, and now we see these underlying patterns of racism? So don't you think that sets us back in what is going well?
Yeah. I mean, thanks for the question. I mean, that certainly can happen, that certain social developments bring to light objectionable features of a society that previously have been lying dormant and have been maybe disguised or covered up, and I think that can happen. But I don't think that thereby means that things are not improving. I mean, still when you, and I'm thinking about the long term here, when you think about social structures that have been in place in the Jim Crow era, in the pre-Civil War antebellum era, certainly obviously the institutionalized racism was much worse at that time. So I think it remains a great idea to try to sniff out these problematic features of society in new and interesting ways, and then to try to remove them. But I wouldn't see how we can conclude from that therefore these trends are not real. Maybe we slightly adjust them a bit and think, it's not quite as an improvement as we thought, right? Because we still see these patterns, but we could still say that there has been quite a bit of improvement, and we want to continue with that in the future.
There was a question from someone watching online as well, Peter Smith, and he likes to know, what do you think is something that we do today, which in 100 years or something will abolish because it's morally better to do so?
Yeah. This may be an unsurprising answer, but I think that's the best case like that. The likeliest scenario is that I think it's pretty likely that we'll think about factory farming the way that we now think about various human rights abuses in the past. I think it's not unlikely that we'll look back on factory farming and meat consumption just for pleasure, right? And think and just find that unintelligible. How could people subject just unimaginable numbers of animals every day to cruelty and death just for no sufficiently weighty reason, at least? So I think that's the likeliest candidate I have for a moral development that I think is going to unfold in this way, and we're going to look back in 100 years or something and think this is just insane.
All right. Well, this is all being recorded, so if anyone else likes to make a prediction or has an idea what will change, feel free to do so.
There is there's another deep point behind this question, which is that these things are very, very hard to anticipate, right? And often we look back and we see that people had no idea what they were doing, right? They had no idea that what they were involved in was morally problematic at all, right? And now we think that, well, isn't it obvious that this is just a moral, catastrophe? How could people not see this? Aristotle defending slavery, or everyone in the history of philosophy, basically, up until recently, thinking that women are inferior and just don't have what it takes to, think. And we think that, well, that's just how could you even arrive at a thought like that? And it's very hard for us to anticipate what people are going to say about the things that we do today, that they will find obviously morally abhorrent. Maybe another case would be that we condemn people to the accidents of the location of their birth. Right? It's just when you are born into this place, you're fine forever, right? Well, more or less, or with very few exceptions, it's basically impossible to reach certain levels of absolute poverty, and the social support is just and the wealth of certain places it's just unimaginable and amazing, and we just lock people out of these fruits by erecting borders and by restricting immigration, even though people are perfectly peaceful and may have something to contribute, and we just don't let them in. That may be another thing that I'm less sure about whether that will happen, but I think that would be a good development to see in the future.
All right, thank you. Is there anyone with a question? Yeah.
You mentioned examples in the beginning of cruelties that we have abolished, but what would you say about the fact that maybe the means of inflicting cruelties have just changed. Let's say weapons of mass destruction, and the problem is that there we're really detached from and we don't feel it right away. Whereas back then, if we kill somebody in a duel, of course we feel it, and it's easier to demoralize this. So what do we do about these new means of inflicting cruelty?
Yeah, I mean, that's often a big problem, that we to some degree, we are naturally averse to torturing others. Right? Most people don't really like to see other people suffer, and so on and so on. So it takes a certain type of a temperament to be able to participate in an execution like that, perhaps. But once we press a button and there is a drone, or we're on a plane and we're dropping bombs, that kind of immediacy of harming a person, that kind of up close and personalness of harming a person, is removed. I think that is in itself a moral problem, because you create the conditions under which cruelty and abuse become psychologically more palatable for people. And you see that this was very effectively used also in the Holocaust, where after a certain point, soldiers would less and less were willing to participate in mass shootings, for instance, which is why in concentration camps people moved on to a more removed method of gassing people, right? And that's not progress, of course, right? That's just making it psychologically easier for people to accept certain types of morally problematic actions. So these kinds of observations, I think, can be used to build an argument that certain technologies have this risk of desensitizing us to morally irrelevant features of people by making them, by turning them just into numbers, or removing them from our field of vision.
Mm-hmm.
Hi. What do you think causes demoralization?
That's a very good question. There doesn't have to be one mechanism. I think one thing that can happen is that sometimes people see that, these people that we just met in a different place, they seem to be doing fine, they seem all right, but they don't do this, right? They don't engage in this practice, and they don't even get what's supposed to be the problem with this thing that we get so hung up about. And that's a kind of culture shock that can sometimes make people aware of the just contingency that is baked into the system of norms that we inherit from our parents, from past generations. So often it's just getting used to a thought that something may not be so bad after all. It can also sometimes be something like an informational cascade phenomenon, where certain visible people in society, maybe celebrities or high prestige individuals, they stop doing something, right? And then people feel entitled and licensed to also, I never wanted to do this, right? I never thought this was a problem. So, and that makes certain things fade away. But there are a bunch of mechanisms that can have this effect, and that's another very worthwhile issue to study, is what are the conditions that need to be in place for people to get rid of silly norms, right?
I saw another question here.
First of all, a lot of thanks for your lecture. There is something I'm pessimistic about, and that is how political speech is getting rid of a lot of facts. And you've just said that moral progress is supported by, or optimism is supported by facts. So is the right observation if I say that when there are less and less facts, we're driven more and more by gut feeling, and moral progress is getting more difficult?
Yeah, thanks a lot. I mean, in some cases, pessimism is supported by the evidence, right? I think overall the balance goes the other way, but just because I've supplied these explanations for why we would be pessimistic, even if that weren't justified, doesn't mean that it's sometimes justified, right? Just because you're paranoid doesn't mean that you're not after you. Sometimes when we look at the facts, a more pessimistic attitude is warranted. I don't think that means that simply because we can identify certain pockets of society where things are getting worse and worse, that doesn't mean that the overall assessment of how things are going has to swing in this pessimistic direction. Plus, I think we sometimes get hung up on comparatively short-term trends. I think it would be hard to resist the impression that, in very recent years there has been a lamentable, trying to phrase this carefully, a lamentable decline in the quality of public discourse, right? A certain laxness in handling the truth, to our detriment and to social and political detriment. But when we adopt the long-term perspective, we see that the kind of bizarre falsities and made-up stuff, what is now called fake news, for instance, or epistemic manipulation of that sort, was just as bad 50 years ago, 100 years ago, 200 years ago, and people were just as careless about libel and insults and lies and bullshit and stuff like that. So, yeah, I do think that we perhaps aren't in the best of times right now when it comes to that compared to the more recent past. But we also see that the quality of political discourse in many places was horrendous for much of history. Indeed, for most of history, there was no political discourse to be polluted like that. Yeah. So again, a more long-term orientation can at least balance the more apocalyptic perceptions of how things are going right now. I'm not saying that yours was apocalyptic, but the more pessimistic ones.
Right. One of the things you study is which institutions we need to get a better moral world.
Yeah.
Could you give an example of some of these institutions? I'm thinking of democracy maybe, but that's also going down the past 12 years, I think. How do you think about that?
Right. Well. I mean, globally speaking, the prevalence and the quality of democratic institutions overall goes up. So there are more and more democracies and more places and countries are swept up in this dynamic towards allowing the citizens of a state to participate in the political process. I mean, there aren't that many really good democracies, and in many cases this process is corrupted and undermined and hollowed out. But I think overall the trend goes in that direction, even though we do see here and there a decline of the quality of democratic discourse again. I mean, I think the kinds of institutions that we need to look for when it comes to engendering further moral progress are going to be institutions that work around our psychologies, right? I mean, there is a lot of truth to this idea that psychologically speaking, our mind is, very roughly speaking, a Stone Age mind, and our cognitive processes and patterns are not really made for the modern world. They're not made for very large, very dynamic, anonymous societies with lots of innovations and new technologies and nothing's familiar and so on and so on. It would be very unusual in the past for someone to meet this many strangers and to be peaceful towards them and amicable and so on and so on. So I think these institutions that bring about moral progress, they will find a way of working around, of bypassing this flawed psychology, or of allowing our worst biases to be channeled into places where they don't do much harm.
And what institutions
Right.
are you thinking of?
So one example that I like to mention is markets, for instance. A lot of people find this surprising because they think that markets have this corrupting influence. I think there is a lot to be said in favor of markets and how they, when they are properly functioning, how they allow people to engage in mutually beneficial cooperation without even knowing it. Right? So this is the kind of bypassing point. Market institutions, they reach through your intentions, and they allow millions of people, many millions of people, to cooperate, as a famous example that's often used, to cooperate in the making of a pencil, right? Without even wanting to do so. You just move around and operate within that institution with all the rules and incentives that are supplied by that institution, and that allows us to create a certain benefit or a certain gain. And so I think these institutions that bring about progress are going to be like that. Democratic institutions are another example, and all of these all of these institutions allow for further improvement, but structurally, the institutions that bring about these gains are going to be like that. But I mean, as always, it's hard to anticipate what types of institutional solutions to cooperative problems we are going to discover in our process of experimentation. Right? It could be that we find many technological solutions to problems. Right? So sometimes you leave your house and it sits empty. And an app allows you to have people rent it, right? Something like that. I mean, that's a trivial example, of course, but there can often be technological solutions that produce a benefit that we had no way of producing before. So that may be another example.
All right, thank you.
All right, thank you for your speech today. I have a question because you showed the GDP growth over time, gross domestic product per capita. And you actually said that is an optimistic data set, but I don't really agree with that because the underlying fact are that there are rising inequalities worldwide, wealth inequalities and income inequalities, and how can we view that optimistically?
Right, and you're absolutely right to insist that these are things that we want to eliminate in the future. I don't want to sound cynical about this, but of course there used to be no inequality or much less inequality in economic terms back in the day because everyone was poor, right? So that kind of, sometimes called the Great Divergence, that kind of thing that some countries, many now, have just created unimaginable wealth compared to most recent phases over the past 10,000 years of human history. I mean, a side effect of that, of course, is inequality. And I think what we want is we want that development to continue sustainably, of course, and find ways of doing that doesn't overstretch the capacities of the planet. But in principle, we want people to share into the I think very obvious benefits that are created simply by wealth.
Yeah, to add something, I'm not just only speaking about inequalities between countries, but also between individuals, and that some countries can only prosper in that way because they're like exploiting other countries and other citizens from other countries' resources.
Yeah. Of course, I mean, there is within country inequality and there is between country inequality. And there are many good reasons for wanting to compress the most extreme forms of inequality because they give too much political control to very wealthy people. They can also lead to races to the bottom where people compete for positional goods that don't make anyone better off, a kind of like keeping up with the Joneses dynamic that ultimately makes everyone worse off because no one gains when everyone has, the latest phone or car. So there are lots of good reasons for compressing inequality to some extent. But when we're talking about within country inequality measured in terms of GDP per capita, in wealthy nations, I think the benefits that accrued to the poorest people in the Netherlands, for instance, or in Germany or the UK, they're so large that they, I think, rather clearly outweigh whatever disadvantages come from rising inequality. And it's not like we know how to build a large society that has no inequality, right? Either you have economic inequality, or if you empower states to mitigate social inequality by redistribution and so on and so on, you also concentrate political power and create differentials there, right? That can lead to corruption, that can lead to abuse, and it often does. And when you look at the past of feudal societies and so on, we just don't really know how to build a large society, not talking about hunter-gatherers, but we don't know how to institutionally pull off building a large society that doesn't have some form of inequality. So I think it's not about picking between inequality and equality. I think it's about picking between the kind of inequality that produces the most benefits in addition, right? And that tends to be, I think, well, in many ways tends to be wealth inequality.
Maybe a follow-up question on that. Do you think it's fair to judge our society, how we're doing today, by comparing it to many years ago? Shouldn't we judge our society by the possibilities we might have today to, for example, create a more equal society, or not to exploit countries, or to not make war, for example?
Well, I think it's fair because I'm just playing the pessimist game, right? I mean, they started it. They started saying that things used to be a-okay, and then when you press them and ask, well, what do you mean? Do you mean women not being able to vote and people being poor and not being able to go places and so on, all that stuff, and children dying, and the list goes on and on and on. So I think when we play the game of pessimism versus optimism, I can help myself to the very comparisons that the pessimists brought into making their point.
Yeah, but let's forget the pessimists. Let's go to here and now. Can we say that maybe we're not doing well, or you think?
Well, things could be better, and we do and should work towards that. But I mean, we aren't forced to compare the current situation to the past. But when we want to figure out how well things are going, I think it's natural to start looking for some comparison point, and then what other point is there? Then other places and other times. So that's the comparison. That, I mean, we can't compare ourselves to the future because we don't know what it's going to be like. So I think, so I would say it's fair to do that, but in doing so, I mean, that's not supposed to be some kind of trick that glosses over the things that are in disarray now, and that are going badly now. It's never supposed to be that. But I think it's in a way it's the opposite. I mean, we need to study how we got to here from there in order to have a shot at figuring out how to improve society even further in the future. So I think it's fair to make that comparison. I don't see an alternative to making such comparisons. Yeah. So I think it's fair. Yeah.
All right. Thank you. Is there any other question? Yeah. I'll get to the stage as well, don't worry.
Yeah, thank you again. My question is, and please correct me if I'm wrong in interpreting this, but it seemed that you said that there's some technological advances sometimes, and then after the fact, it appears that those give us some sense of moral progress. Maybe in the healthcare sector, we develop some new medicine, and more people are alive because we have eradicated polio or something. It seems as though if that's the case, moral progress is more of an effect than a cause. And then my question is, are we kind of like discovering this moral progress, or are we developing an actual framework? And then the other question is, if there is actually moral progress within these technologies, is it somehow implicit, and what kind of normative framework are we talking?
Right, good question. So on the first one, and remind me of the second one if I forget it, which I tend to do. Now I've forgotten the first one as well. Yeah, so I think yes, moral progress is often an effect of social developments. When we eradicate polio, we become much more intolerant towards the possibility that someone may have polio, right? We become, it becomes a much more horrific possibility to contemplate that someone may have, and that's an effect of certain technological advance. But it's not just an effect, right? It's no accident that we tried that people have been working on this type of vaccine for decades, and that many teams all over the world have made incremental progress towards, I think in the early 50s, towards finally eradicating polio in the affluent world. And I think very recently, wasn't it very recently that I think a definitive end to polio was declared in sub-Saharan Africa? Is that correct? But I think that's the region that we're talking about. So it's not an accident that it's not an accident that we have been desperately putting resources into the development of a polio vaccine rather than inventing some silly machine that produces, a bizarre item that no one needs, right? So it's both a cause and an effect. Our values guide the things that we want to promote and bring about, and once we have made certain changes, that feeds back into our values and improves them or changes them in various ways. Sorry, the second question.
Yeah, so then it's kind of like maybe a chicken egg kind of story. So both interact with each other, both the cause and the effect. But if we look at it purely from the effect side, then there's some normative framework that's apparent in this. And of course, with things like polio, it's very obvious that we don't want people to die, and I think that's very common among different normative frameworks, but there's probably some cases where that isn't as obvious, and then it seems the question, how do we assess which effects from certain technologies are good moral progress and which aren't?
Right, right. So it's, that's a version of a very fundamental problem in philosophy in general, right? How do you assess the quality of something, right? The epistemic quality of something. How do you know that you're actually knowing more and not less? How do you distinguish scientific progress from losses of knowledge, for instance? And what are the criteria that you can avail yourself of in making that judgment, right? So a natural thought seems to be that, okay, we have some state of affairs A, like 100 years ago, or 200 years ago, and now we have state of affairs B, maybe today or 10 years ago. And these states of affairs, we want to compare them in terms of, which of these two ranks higher in terms of moral quality or in terms of scientific progress, right? An tempting thing to want to have in this situation is to have some third reference point in light of which to adjudicate that question. And here I must say, I don't think such a thing exists. I don't think such a thing is forthcoming. I don't think we need it, though, and that's the good news. I think the standards for judging improvements and progress are internal to these progressive developments themselves. We don't have some sort of yardstick that we can take out of the closet and then see, was this, was the eradication of foot binding an improvement or not? And let's look at it in light of the yardstick. Oh, it was. Oh, great. So now we can put it back, and we've solved that problem. It couldn't work like that, and it doesn't work like that, and it doesn't have to work like that. We are, in a way, it goes back to this Neurathship metaphor, right? We cannot bring our moral code back into the dock to reconstruct it from scratch, right? We have to keep our moral system afloat while we're on it, right? And the improvements that we make have to be made sort of on the go. That's all we have, but I don't think that means that we don't know what's worse and what's better. We just use the criteria and standards and reasons that are internal to our evaluation of what people do. So when a practice is abolished that produces no benefit but significant harm on 50% of people, right, like foot binding, like female genital mutilation, right, where all the harms are imagined, or if any, very minor in the case of foot binding, they're kind of basically like social, positional, prestige reasons. So we look at, what are the reasons recommending this practice? What are the reasons that recommend against this practice? And I think the answer very clearly favors the one side. And I mean, not you, but if people say, well, how do we know that inflicting gratuitous harm on 50% of the population is a bad thing? I have no reply.
All right, we have a few last minutes, so I'm gonna go to the stage as I promised, and I hope it's an easy question and a very easy answer.
Yeah, well, I think it's kind of a simple one. It's more of a clearing up question, really. Well, it seems to me that, like, the reason to assert that pessimism is bad is like of its indirect effects on. You're looking to the past, or you maybe you forget to look at the things that went well. Mm-hmm. So if you are overly pessimistic, then it can be the case. It's kind of a conservative argument then, in a sense, that if you are too pessimistic to what has went into creating the good things as they are now, then you run the risk of destroying what you don't see, or something like that. Is that accurate?
Can you maybe say a little bit more? I don't quite see it yet. So are you talking about?
Okay, well,
conservatism as a political position, or
sure,
or pessimism as a psychological disposition, or?
I'm talking about like both as political positions, mm-hmm. I think, because you were talking about it's very hard to create a society from scratch, right?
Yeah,
that's very difficult.
Yeah,
and you keep going into. I was wondering, like, it seems to me that it's indirectly important that we are optimistic.
That we are optimistic.
Yeah, that we're optimistic, and it's also indirectly important that we are not pessimistic. And the reason why we should be optimistic and not pessimistic is because if we're pessimistic, then we run the risk of focusing too much on what goes wrong and not enough on what maybe went right.
Right. Okay.
Creating the society as it is.
Okay, thanks. So this could be like an extra argument why we should, when in doubt, lean towards the optimistic side rather than the pessimistic side.
Well, maybe it's an extra argument. My question was if that was, in actual fact, your argument, but.
Well, even better if it's yours, right? Then I'm going to steal that for the next one. It could be, when you connect that to the cultural evolution point, it could be, we don't really know how to design societies that work from scratch. We don't really know how to export institutions. And the way that societies work, because it's largely intransparent to us how these things interlock and what makes them work in this time, in this place, and with these people, could supply an extra reason why we shouldn't be pessimistic, because that may undermine the very working of this thing that we've inherited from the past. So yeah, thanks a lot.
Well, that's great. We got to a new conclusion totally in the end. May I have a warm applause for Dr. Hanno Sauer?
Thanks a lot.
Hanno, thanks a lot. Thanks to you all as well for coming tonight. As I said, this is the first lecture in a series of 4. So if you like, next month we have a lecture as well by a psychologist, and it's more personal about why some people tend to be optimistic and others pessimistic, and how that's also in our genes and the way we grew up. The month after, we have a historian talking about optimism and pessimism in the great ideologies of the 20th century, and how those views of the world also shape policies. And in the last month, we talk about numbers again, and about the way we interpreted data, for example, data like these, and the assumptions that underlie our measurements. So if you like, please be welcome to come to those lectures as well, or watch them online. You can also follow them through our website. And for tonight, this was it. I hope you all became maybe a little bit more optimistic or not, or really critical, and you learned a lot. That's also good. Have a good evening, and you can exit through there, as I said before.